The house had always spoken to Margaret in quiet ways: the hum of the refrigerator at dawn, the soft creak of the hallway floorboards she had repaired herself, the morning light that spilled through lace curtains she'd sewn by hand decades ago. At 66, she knew every sound, every shadow. That Tuesday afternoon, though, the house went silent in a way that made her chest tighten. She stood at the kitchen counter, steeping chamomile tea, her hands trembling just enough to slosh hot water over the rim. Her phone buzzed once on the table, a voice message from Grace. Margaret smiled automatically. Old habits died hard. Her daughter rarely sent voice messages anymore, too busy, too rushed. Margaret wiped her hands on a dish towel and pressed play, expecting something simple. A reminder, a grocery request, maybe a tired "love you, Mom." What came instead felt like ice poured straight into her veins. "I can't take having my mother in this house anymore." Grace's voice sounded unfamiliar, flat, sharp, stripped of warmth. Margaret's breath caught. She leaned against the counter, the tea forgotten. "She's a nuisance," Grace continued. "She's always in the way, always asking questions. And we're already spending so much money on her." Margaret's knees weakened. She slid into the kitchen chair as if someone had cut the strings holding her upright. This wasn't frustration. This wasn't stress. This was contempt. "I found a place," Grace said. "It's cheap, $800 a month. Not great. But honestly, it's good enough. Good enough." The words echoed off the walls Margaret had painted herself, late at night, after 12-hour cleaning shifts. Walls that had held Grace's childhood drawings. Walls that had heard lullabies whispered through exhaustion. Margaret's heart pounded as the message continued, each sentence heavier than the last. "I checked the house papers. It's still in her name, but Carol knows how to transfer it. She works at the county office. She says it'll be easy." Margaret's fingers dug into the wooden table. Carol, the cousin who smiled too much, the one with folders and excuses. "In a month," Grace said, laughing softly, "we'll own everything. And Mom will be home. We can finally have peace." The laugh was the worst part. Not angry, not nervous, casual, like discussing dinner plans. The message ended. Margaret sat frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear, replaying the words in her mind as if repetition might soften them. It didn't. The betrayal hit her in waves: first disbelief, then grief, then a hollow ache so deep it felt physical. She thought of her hands, cracked from bleach and cold water, of jewelry sold, meals skipped, dreams postponed, of a teenage girl walking to kindergarten in polished shoes because her mother had nothing else to give except effort. This was the same daughter she had protected from the world, the same child she had loved without condition. Margaret stood slowly, her reflection catching in the dark window. Her eyes looked older suddenly, but clearer too. They thought she was weak. They were wrong. And as the sun slipped lower behind the house she had built with her life, Margaret Baker felt something rise inside her that hadn't stirred in years. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed staring at the ceiling fan, watching it slice the darkness into slow, useless circles. Every turn pulled her deeper into memories she hadn't visited in years, memories of becoming the kind of woman who gave until there was nothing left to give. She hadn't always been strong. She'd learned strength the way most women of her generation did, through necessity. Margaret grew up in a small working-class neighborhood where backyards were patched with chain-link fences and everyone knew who was struggling, even if no one said it out loud. Her mother, Evelyn, was a seamstress who woke before the sun and stitched long after it disappeared. The rhythmic hum of the sewing machine had been the soundtrack of Margaret's childhood. "Family is everything," her mother would say, guiding young Margaret's hands over fabric. "For family, you give until your hands are empty." Those words carved themselves into Margaret's bones. When Margaret was 18, love came fast and left faster. Grace's father promised a wedding, a future, stability. One night he kissed her forehead and swore he wasn't going anywhere. By morning, he was gone. His parents slammed the door in Margaret's face, calling her a mistake, a distraction, a lesson their son wouldn't repeat. Margaret remembered standing on the sidewalk afterward, clutching her stomach, the future already heavy inside her. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She wrapped Margaret in her arms and said, "That child will never feel unwanted. We'll raise her together." True to her word, Evelyn sold her 2 gold bracelets, the only jewelry she owned, to buy baby clothes and a crib. Margaret watched them disappear into a pawnshop window, understanding for the first time that love wasn't words. It was sacrifice. Grace was born on a humid summer morning, small and loud and perfect. Margaret remembered holding her, thinking the world had finally given her something worth every loss. 1819. Margaret cleaned houses for a living. Rich houses with white carpets and refrigerators bigger than her kitchen. She scrubbed floors on her knees while imagining Grace's future, one where her daughter wouldn't have to bow her head to anyone. The day Margaret walked Grace to kindergarten, they couldn't afford bus fare. Grace's uniform was ironed. Crisp anyway. Her shoes shined like mirrors. Other mothers arrived in sedans, sunglasses perched perfectly, while Margaret stood in a patched dress with hands that smelled faintly of bleach. Grace kissed her cheek and whispered, "You're the best mom in the world." That sentence fueled Margaret for decades. Her days blurred into routine. Up before dawn, breakfast packed, school drop-off, 3 houses cleaned, groceries bought carefully, homework supervised, stories read by a tired voice at bedtime. Weekends meant laundry jobs. Holidays meant overtime. When Evelyn died, Grace was 8. Margaret thought she might break under the weight of being alone, but Evelyn's final words became her anchor. "She'll take care of you one day," her mother promised. "Our blood is good." Margaret believed that with a faith stronger than reason. She worked extra months to give Grace a 15th birthday party, ignoring the leaking roof. She sold jewelry, took loans, skipped meals so Grace could go to college. When Grace signed her enrollment papers, Margaret cried like she'd won the lottery. "I'll give it all back," Grace promised, hugging her. "Everything." Margaret carried those words through every blister, every ache, every lonely night. Now, lying awake decades later, Margaret stared into the darkness and realized something terrifying. She had given Grace everything and never once taught her where the line was. Margaret used to believe a house could protect you. She had built hers slowly, patiently, like a promise you keep to yourself when no one else will. Every brick had been paid for with sore muscles and early mornings. Every room carried proof that persistence could turn poverty into something solid. When Grace and Richard asked to stay just for a month, Margaret felt relief bloom in her chest. Maybe this was the closeness she'd been missing. Maybe God was giving her a second chance at Sunday dinners and laughter around the table. "I'd love that," Margaret said without hesitation. "This is your home too." The lies slipped in quietly. The first week felt almost normal. Grace unpacked her things, humming softly. Richard joked about the old TV, but Margaret laughed along. She told herself young people complained. That was life. By the second week, the house started changing. Richard frowned at the shower pressure. "This plumbing is ancient," he muttered. One morning, not safe for someone your age, Grace began rearranging cabinets without asking. "Mom, these plates are so outdated," she said cheerfully, stacking Margaret's dishes into boxes. "I'll donate them." Margaret watched. Her hands erased decades of habit. She didn't argue. Mothers didn't argue. Mothers adjusted. The quiet conversation started soon after. Whispered discussions that stopped the second Margaret entered the room. The clink of coffee cups, the shuffle of papers hastily hidden. "What were you talking about?" Margaret asked once, trying to sound casual. "Just expenses," Grace replied too quickly. "Nothing you need to worry about." Worry, Margaret learned, didn't need permission. One afternoon she overheard Richard on the patio. "No, she doesn't suspect a thing," he said. "Carol says 2 more weeks." When Margaret stepped outside, Richard jumped. "Work stuff," he said, smiling too wide. Then came the concern, sweetly packaged, sharply edged. "Mom," Grace said one evening, lowering her voice, "Richard thinks you've been forgetting things lately." Margaret laughed, uneasy. "Everyone forgets sometimes. That's what scares us," Grace said gently. "You don't notice it." Margaret felt something shift inside her. A seed planted, doubt watered, The visits followed. Doctors Margaret never requested. Social workers who examined her shelves and asked pointed questions. A geriatric specialist who smiled too kindly while writing notes. She's physically fine, he told Grace in the living room, unaware Margaret was listening. But I'll note mild confusion. Just to be safe. Safe for whom? Grace started managing the bills to help. She questioned Margaret's cash withdrawals. Why do you need so much? She asked, eyes sharp. Margaret stopped driving, stopped shopping alone, stopped feeling like herself. The worst came when lies escaped the house. Oh, Mom's been confused lately, Grace told Margaret's longtime friend one afternoon. She thought it was morning at night. Margaret stared at her daughter in disbelief. The lie hung in the air like smoke. Visitors began showing up, unannounced people checking on her welfare. Each one chipped away at Margaret's sense of reality, her confidence, her dignity. The house no longer felt like shelter.it, felt like surveillance. Margaret found herself shrinking, speaking less, moving carefully, apologizing for existing. The woman who had survived abandonment, poverty, and decades of labor now hesitated before opening her own refrigerator. At night, she walked the halls quietly, touching door frames, remembering birthday mornings and school projects taped to walls. She didn't know yet that the house wasn't just changing. It was being taken, and the people doing it were sleeping down the hall. Tuesday arrived heavy and gray, the kind of day that pressed down on Margaret's chest before anything even happened. Grace and Richard left early, whispering by the door like teenagers sneaking out. Grace kissed Margaret's cheek, warm and practiced. Rest today, Mom, she said. We'll be back later. The house exhaled when they left. Silence returned, thick and uneasy. Margaret tried to settle into routine, watering plants, folding laundry, but the walls felt closer than usual. The home she once ruled now seemed to watch her. She stood at the stove mid-afternoon, heating water for tea, when her phone chimed. A voice message. From Grace. Margaret smiled faintly. Old reflex. She pressed play. The words hit her like a slap. I can't take having my mother in this house anymore. Margaret froze, the kettle screaming behind her. She turned it off without hearing it, her heart pounding in her ears. She's a nuisance, always in our business, and we're already spending too much money on her. Margaret sank into a chair. The room tilted. I found a place, Grace continued. $800 a month. It's not great, but it's fine for someone like her. Someone like her. Margaret's throat closed. She clutched the phone as if it were a railing. Then came the sentence that split her life clean in two. I checked the house papers. It's in her name, but Carol knows how to transfer it without her realizing. Margaret's hands shook violently now. Every puzzle piece slammed into place. Carol's visits, the documents, the doctors, the whispers. Grace laughed softly. In a month, Mom will be in the home, and we'll finally have peace. We'll own everything. The message ended. No apology, no hesitation, just laughter. Margaret slid to the kitchen floor, the phone pressed to her chest. She replayed the message once, twice, 10 times. Each time, it cut deeper, stripping away denial until only truth remained. They weren't worried about her. They were planning her removal. Her mind raced through the details. She had ignored the fake concern, the financial control, the stories told behind her back. This wasn't care.it was a strategy. Margaret stayed there for hours, staring at the floor tiles she had scrubbed 1,000 times. She thought of the house, every nail driven by hope, every sacrifice poured into its walls. It wasn't just property.it was proof she had mattered. As evening fell, grief slowly transformed into something colder, sharper. She wiped her face, stood, and walked the length of the house, touching furniture, photos, memories. They thought she was confused. They thought she was weak. Margaret stopped in front of the hallway mirror. The woman staring back looked older than she felt, but her eyes were clear, fierce even. I raised you, she whispered. You learned this from me. She didn't sleep that night. She planned. At dawn, Margaret dressed with intention. She chose her crimson suit, the one she wore when Grace graduated college. She pinned her hair neatly, applied lipstick with steady hands, and placed her mother's pearl earrings in her ears. She gathered documents, deeds, IDs, bank statements, and slipped them into her purse. Before leaving, she wrote a note and placed it on the kitchen table. Out early. Taking care of personal matters. Love, Mom. It was the last courtesy she would offer. Margaret stepped outside. As the sun rose, locking the door behind her. For the first time in months, her back was straight. They had underestimated her, and that mistake would cost them everything. Margaret arrived at the bank the moment the doors opened, the glass reflecting her crimson suit like armor. She had been coming to this branch for over 15 years, long enough that the manager, Nora, looked up and smiled when she saw her. "Good morning, Miss Baker," Nora said. "What can I help you with today?" Margaret returned the smile, calm and deliberate. "I need to review every transaction on my accounts for the last 6 months. And I need to change my beneficiaries." Nora blinked. "Of course. Let's sit down." As the screen filled with numbers, Margaret felt her stomach tighten. Withdrawals she hadn't made. Inquiries she hadn't authorized. Notes marked assisted access. "Miss Baker," Nora said carefully, "your daughter has been reviewing your statements. She provided a letter signed by you." Margaret's jaw set. "May I see it?" The signature stared back at her close enough to fool someone who wanted to believe it. But Margaret knew her own hand. "This wasn't it. That's a forgery," Margaret said calmly. "I never signed this." Nora paled. "We need to cancel all access immediately." "Yes," Margaret replied. "And I want all my funds moved into a new account today." An hour later, her savings sat safely beyond Grace's reach. Passwords changed. Alerts activated. Her life insurance reassigned to a foundation that helped abandoned seniors. Margaret didn't cry. She didn't shake. Each step grounded her further. Her next stop was the county clerk's office. Carol looked up from her desk and froze. "Aunt Margaret?" Margaret smiled sweetly. "I came to ask about my property." Carol's hands trembled. Papers disappeared into drawers too quickly. "Could you explain exactly what documents you've been preparing with my name on them?" Margaret asked gently. Carol stammered. Sweat dotted her forehead. Margaret leaned closer and placed her phone on the desk. "I have a recording," she said softly, "of Grace explaining everything. And I have proof of forgery." Carol collapsed into her chair. Between sobs, she confessed fake signatures, false medical reports, plans to declare Margaret incompetent. Margaret listened, unmoved. "You'll help me reverse everything," she said, "or I take this to your supervisor." Carol agreed instantly. By noon, Margaret had copies of every fraudulent document. Her final stop was attorney Harrison Ford, a man with sharp eyes and a reputation for integrity. "This is elder fraud," he said after reviewing the evidence, "and a serious one. I want justice," Margaret said, "and I want my dignity back." They worked until evening, lawsuits prepared, criminal complaints filed. Margaret returned home changed. Grace smiled from the couch. "How were your errands, Mom?" Margaret met her gaze evenly. "Very productive." That night, Margaret slept peacefully for the first time in months, because tomorrow, the truth would knock on the door. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 o'clock the next morning. Margaret had been waiting for it, seated upright in her favorite armchair, hands folded calmly in her lap. The house felt different, lighter somehow, as if it, too, knew that a reckoning had arrived. "I'll get it," she said before Grace or Richard could move. When Margaret opened the door, the hallway filled with unfamiliar authority. Attorney Harrison Ford stood front and center, flanked by 2 uniformed police officers and a public notary holding a leather folder. "Good morning, Miss Baker," Ford said evenly. "We're here to proceed." Grace rose from the couch, color draining from her face. "Mom?" she asked, her voice thin. "What is this?" "Sit down," Margaret said quietly. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. "You're about to hear some things." Richard took a step forward, his jaw tightening. "This is ridiculous. What's going on?" Attorney Ford cleared his throat. "Mr. Richard Williams and Ms. Grace Baker, we are here regarding multiple instances of fraud. falsification of documents and conspiracy to illegally appropriate property belonging to Miss Margaret Baker. Grace laughed nervously. That's insane. We'd never. Margaret raised her phone. Do you want me to play the message you accidentally sent me? The silence that followed was brutal. Grace's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face like a crack in glass. Mom, please. Margaret pressed play. Grace's voice filled the living room, cold and unmistakable. I can't take having my mother in this house anymore. Richard staggered back as if struck. Grace lunged forward, but one of the officers stepped between them. Turn it off. Grace screamed. That's private. No, Margaret said evenly. This is the truth. The recording continued talk of the nursing home, the forged documents, the plan to take the house. Grace's own laughter echoed through the room, grotesque and undeniable. When the audio stopped, the room felt smaller, heavier. Attorney Ford laid documents on the coffee table one by one. Forged bank authorizations, false medical reports, a written confession from Carol Rodriguez detailing your involvement. Grace shook her head wildly. She's lying. She's trying to save herself. Margaret reached into her purse and placed a small recorder on the table. That's Carol's voice, she said calmly, confessing. In her office, Richard sank onto the couch, hands covering his face. This can't be happening. Ford continued. Miss Baker also underwent a full psychological evaluation yesterday. The results confirm she is mentally sound and fully competent. Grace collapsed to her knees. Mom, please. We were desperate. We thought it was best for you. Margaret stood slowly, every movement deliberate. You thought stealing my home was best for me? Lying about my mind? Planning my confinement? Grace sobbed. We just needed money. Margaret's voice trembled not with weakness, but with restrained fury. I gave you money. I gave you my life. What you needed was honesty. The officer stepped forward. Miss Baker, do you wish to proceed? Margaret looked at her daughter, at the woman who had once clung to her hand crossing the street, who had promised to take care of her someday. Yes, Margaret said firmly. Proceed. As the handcuffs closed around Grace's wrists, Margaret felt pain sharp and deep, but beneath it, something steadier. Dignity. As Grace was led away, she cried, You're all I have. Margaret whispered, You chose to make me disposable. The door closed behind them. For the first time in months, the house was quiet again, and it finally belonged to her. The silence after Grace and Richard were taken away didn't last long. At first, Margaret welcomed it. She walked through her house slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the edge of the kitchen counter, the banisters she had polished so many times it shone. For the first time in months, no one watched her movements. No one corrected her choices. The house breathed again. Then the retaliation began. It started online. Margaret didn't even know she was being attacked until her neighbor, Miss Rose, knocked on her door with worry written across her face. Honey, she said gently, holding up her phone. People are saying awful things about you. Grace had created fake profiles and posted in local Facebook groups. My mother has dementia. She falsely accused us. If you see her alone, please call me. She's not safe. Photos followed. Cropped, edited, moments taken out of context and twisted into proof of instability. Margaret felt physically sick scrolling through the comments. Strangers speculated about her mind, her morality, her worth as a mother. She looks confused. Some parents just turn on their kids. Sad when old people don't know what they're doing. The phone calls came next. Anonymous voices dripping with cruelty. You're a miserable old woman, one caller hissed at 3 a.m. I hope you die alone. Margaret started unplugging the phone at night. Then came the visitors. Fake social workers, concerned neighbors she'd never met, salesmen warning her how vulnerable she was as a single elderly woman. Each knock sent a jolt through her chest. Attorney Ford explained it calmly. They're trying to discredit you. If they can make you look unstable, they weaken your case. The letters hurt the most. Handwritten envelopes arrived with no return address. Inside, poison spilled freely. You failed as a mother. No wonder your daughter hates you. You were always just a servant. What did you expect? One night, Margaret sat on the kitchen floor, the same place she'd heard the message that changed everything, and cried until her chest ached. For the first time since taking action, doubt crept in. Had she gone too far? Was she cruel for choosing the law over forgiveness? Her hand hovered over her phone, ready to call the attorney and end it all. Drop the charges. Make peace. Take the abuse if it meant family. Then she remembered her mother. Margaret rose unsteadily and opened the small wooden chest at the foot of her bed. Inside lay an old letter, yellowed with time. Evelyn's handwriting trembled across the page. Don't allow anyone, not even your own child, to trample your dignity. Margaret pressed the paper to her chest and sobbed, not from weakness, but from recognition. She hadn't failed as a mother. She had simply loved too much without boundaries. The next morning, she called Attorney Ford. Proceed with everything, she said firmly. All charges. A week later, Grace's lawyer reached out, requesting a settlement. Money returned. Damages paid. A public confession clearing Margaret's name. Margaret agreed with one condition. They must publicly admit the lies, she said. Wherever they defamed me. When the statement went live, the narrative shattered. Grace and Richard's names filled headlines. Family betrayal exposed. Elder fraud case shocks community. The calls stopped. The letters ceased. Margaret stood alone in her living room, sunlight streaming through the windows, and felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Peace. Not because she'd won, but because she'd finally chosen herself. Exactly 1 month after the truth came out, Margaret stood in her living room surrounded by boxes and silence. Not the heavy silence of fear or betrayal, but the clean, echoing quiet of closure. The house was no longer a battlefield. It was a memory. She had made her decision without drama. This place holds too much pain, she told Attorney Ford as they reviewed papers at the dining table. I don't want to die where I was almost erased. Ford nodded, respectful. And your estate? Margaret didn't hesitate. I'm leaving it to the Golden Hope Foundation. Seniors abandoned by their families. People who need protection, not entitlement. When the house sold, Margaret felt no regret, only relief. She bought a modest apartment in a residential community for active seniors, sunlit, warm, surrounded by gardens and laughter. The kind of place where people waved because they wanted to, not because they were watching. The first morning there, Margaret made coffee in a kitchen that fit her life now, not her past. She sat on the balcony and listened to birds instead of whispers. For the first time in years, her shoulders relaxed. She made friends easily. Nora from next door invited her to dance class. We're not dead yet, she joked. Margaret laughed. Harder than she had in years, she discovered painting soft landscapes, wide skies. Her hands, once cracked from bleach, now moved gently across canvas. At the local art fair, a woman bought one of her paintings and said, "It feels peaceful." Margaret smiled. That peace had been earned. She volunteered at Golden Hope 3 days a week. Seniors came in broken, ashamed, afraid. Margaret listened not with pity, but understanding. How did you survive it? One man asked, tears in his eyes. Margaret answered honestly. I stopped believing love meant suffering. News of Grace and Richard reached her occasionally. Jobs lost, friends gone, debt piled high. Their marriage cracked under the weight of their own choices. Margaret felt no joy in it, only a quiet sadness for what greed had destroyed. One afternoon, she ran into Grace at the mall. Grace looked smaller, older, her eyes filled with tears. Mom, please forgive me. Margaret met her gaze calmly. I have. Hope flared briefly in Grace's eyes. Then we can know, Margaret said gently. Forgiveness is for my peace, not an invitation back into my life. Grace crumpled. Margaret walked away without looking back. That night, Margaret wrote in her journal, freedom isn't loud, it's quiet. It's the absence of fear. She had learned something most people never do. Love without boundaries isn't love. It's surrender. And Margaret Baker was done surrendering. A year passed more quietly than Margaret had ever lived before. Time no longer rushed her out of bed or cornered her with obligations disguised as love. It unfolded gently, like pages she could finally read at her own pace. One afternoon in early spring, as sunlight spilled across her kitchen floor, Margaret found an envelope slipped beneath her door. The handwriting stopped her cold. Grace. Margaret stood there for a long moment, envelope in hand, feeling the old ache not sharp anymore, but deep, like a healed bone that still remembered the break. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she made tea, sat by the window, let herself breathe. That night, with her neighbor Nora sitting beside her for support, Margaret finally opened the letter. Dear Mom, I know I have no right to write to you. Grace wrote about therapy, about regret, about finally understanding that desperation hadn't driven her actions, entitlement had. She admitted she'd stopped seeing Margaret as a person and started seeing her as a resource. I lost the best mother in the world because of my greed, Grace wrote. I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope you're happy. Margaret's eyes burned, but she didn't cry the way she once would have. The letter wasn't a wound reopening, it was a scar being acknowledged. She took 3 days before responding. Grace, she wrote carefully, I forgive you because resentment poisons the one who carries it. But forgiveness does not restore trust, and it does not erase consequences. I wish you healing. My life is peaceful now, and I intend to keep it that way. She sealed the envelope with calm finality. A T golden hope. Margaret's story began circulating beyond the building. Other seniors sought her out, not because she was loud or angry, but because she was living proof that dignity could be reclaimed. How did you find the courage? An 81-year-old woman asked, gripping Margaret's hand. Margaret answered softly, I realize that enduring abuse isn't strength. Ending it is. She helped dozens navigate legal systems, rebuild confidence, and most importantly, believe themselves again. Each story was different, but the pattern was painfully familiar. Love twisted into leverage. Care used as control. A T night. Margaret reflected often, not on what she'd lost, but on what she'd learned. She had confused self-sacrifice with virtue. She had believed being needed was the same as being loved. And she had taught her daughter unintentionally that her boundaries didn't matter. That lesson had cost them both dearly. One evening, Attorney Ford called. Margaret, other families want you to speak. Your story is helping people. Margaret smiled. Then it was worth telling. Later that night, standing on her balcony as the sun dipped low, Margaret felt something settle in her heart, not bitterness, not sorrow, acceptance. She hadn't failed as a mother. She had survived as a woman, and survival, she'd learned, sometimes meant walking away from the very people who taught you how to walk. On the morning of her 67th birthday, Margaret woke before the alarm, the way she always had, but for the first time in decades, there was no urgency waiting for her, no obligation pulling at her bones. No one needed anything from her. Sunlight filtered through white curtains. She'd chosen herself, no arguments, no justifications. She lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of a life that finally belonged to her. She brewed coffee slowly, savoring the smell, then stepped onto the balcony overlooking the gardens. Seniors strolled below, some walking dogs, others laughing softly as they stretched for morning exercise. These were people who valued independence, who respected one another's space and stories. Happy birthday, Margaret. Nora called from below, waving. Margaret smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. She had found something here she never expected: community without control, connection without cost. Her days were full now, but not exhausting. Dance class twice a week, painting in the afternoons, where her canvases reflected wide skies and open roads, places that felt like freedom. At Golden Hope, she spent hours listening to stories that mirrored her own, guiding others through fear with calm certainty. You give us hope, a volunteer once told her. Margaret thought of the irony. For most of her life, hope had come at the expense of herself. Now it flowed from a place of balance. Occasionally, memories surfaced: Grace as a child, asleep against her shoulder, the sound of applause at graduation, the feel of small hands trusting her completely. Those memories still hurt, but they no longer controlled her. One afternoon, while organizing files at the foundation, Margaret paused, struck by a sudden clarity. She had raised Grace to succeed. She had forgotten to teach her that success without integrity destroys everything it touches. That realization didn't come with anger, only understanding. That evening, Margaret dressed for dinner downtown with friends she'd chosen. She caught her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her posture was upright. Her eyes were bright. There was confidence there, not loud or demanding, but unshakable. At dinner, glasses clinked. To Margaret, Nora said, raising her wine, "For showing us it's never too late to choose yourself." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, not of sadness but gratitude. Later that night, walking home under city lights, Margaret thought of all the women her age who believed it was too late to change, too late to leave, too late to demand respect. She wished she could tell them what she now knew, that age doesn't weaken you, it clarifies you, that love should never require your erasure, that boundaries are not rejection, they are survival. Margaret unlocked her apartment and stepped inside, heart full. She stood in the quiet living room, surrounded by art she'd created, furniture she'd chosen, and peace she'd earned. 8067, she wasn't winding down, she was finally beginning. Margaret stood on her balcony one quiet evening as the sun slipped behind the buildings, painting the sky in soft oranges and fading golds. At 67, she had learned to love sunsets not as symbols of endings, but as proof that beauty didn't disappear with age. It simply changed form. Below her, the gardens of the residential complex were alive with quiet joy. Couples strolled, hand in hand. A group of seniors laughed over a card game. Somewhere, music drifted from an open window, an old Motown song that reminded Margaret of cleaning houses with a radio balanced on the counter. Dreaming of a better future for her daughter, she smiled sadly at the memory, then let it pass. Her phone buzzed. A message from the Golden Hope Foundation. Another family seeking guidance. Another senior afraid of losing everything to the people they loved most. Margaret replied without hesitation, "I can help." That had become her purpose now, not fixing others, not sacrificing herself, but standing as proof that dignity could be reclaimed. That age did not make someone disposable. That kindness did not mean permission. Later that night, Margaret sat at her small dining table, journaling as she often did. She wrote about the woman she had been, exhausted, loyal to a fault, afraid that saying no would make her unlivable. She wrote about the moment that changed everything. A single voice message that shattered illusion and forced truth into the open. What struck her most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was how long she had ignored the warning signs because she believed love required endurance. She thought of her mother's words, "Family is everything," and finally understood what had been missing from that lesson. Family, real family, didn't strip you of your humanity. It didn't see your aging body as a burden or your life's work as an asset to be seized. Real love protected. It respected. It never plotted your disappearance. Margaret closed her journal and walked through her apartment, touching the walls, the furniture, the paintings she had made with hands once raw from labor. None of this was grand. None of it was extravagant. But it was hers, and no one could take it away. Grace crossed her mind occasionally, not with longing, not with rage, but with clarity. Margaret had forgiven her truly. But forgiveness had not erased truth, and truth had drawn a line that could not be uncrossed. Some relationships, she had learned, ended not because love was absent, but because respect was. That was the lesson she shared now, every time a frightened senior sat across from her at the foundation, whispering, "But they're my children." Margaret would lean forward and say gently, "And you're still a person." On the night of her 67th birthday, Margaret raised a glass with her chosen family friends, bound not by blood, but by mutual care. Laughter filled the restaurant. Life felt wide again. As she walked home under the streetlights, Margaret realized something profound. Her greatest inheritance was never the house, never the money, never even motherhood as she had defined it for decades. Her greatest inheritance was self-respect, and she had claimed it late, but not too late. Because the truth is this: no matter your age, no matter how much you've given, you are never obligated to sacrifice your dignity to keep someone in your life. Sometimes the bravest act of love is walking away, and sometimes the most powerful chapter of your life doesn't begin in youth, but in the moment you finally choose yourself. So if you're listening to this and wondering whether it's too late to stand up, to set boundaries, to protect what's left of your life, remember Margaret. It is never too late to be free.